So friends, if you haven't had a chance to do so yet, I would invite you to go home and look at the email that we sent out on Thursday, the weekly email, and perhaps find the newsletter for this month. And in there, you'll find a link for the On Being Project podcast called This Movie Changed Me. And if you go listen to that, you can hear the story that I'm about to tell you from Monsignor Charles Pope in his own words. Of course, we all have movies that have deeply affected us and resonated with us. You've actually heard me preach on Toy Story before, and the way that Andy writes his name on the bottom of Woody's shoe, and how it's like God inscribing God's name on our hearts. There are holy things to be found all over if we just have the eyes to see them. It happens in movies too. So I would invite you to open your hearts and your minds and receive this gift of a story from Monsignor Charles Pope this morning. As we prepare to do so, would you pray with me? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be found acceptable in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Before he was Monsignor Charles Pope of the Diocese of the Roman Catholic Church that is in Washington, D.C., he was Father Charles Pope. And in 1995, he was 33 years old and was invited to be the lead pastor at a church in Washington, D.C. He was the youngest priest to ever pastor a church in that diocese. This was a big deal. It came with power and prestige and a lot of responsibility. And I suspect that if we've lived any life at all, we've had these moments, right? When we're invited to do something that seems just a little outside of our reach, but oh, it's such a good opportunity, and so here we go. And our college students and graduates, if this hasn't happened to you yet, it will. And then I want you to remember this sermon, okay? Because we all know sometimes life does not work out the way that we hope. Sometimes we reach just beyond our comfort zone, and it makes us grow and change in ways that are life-giving. And other times we take a step outside of our comfort zone and we fail dramatically. Well, that's what happened to then Father Charles Pope. He explains that shortly after taking this position, he started to have panic attacks. It was a complicated parish that he was asked to pastor. He did not have the experience or the know-how to be able to do it. And it began to take a toll on his health. Eventually, he needed to be hospitalized. He had a mental health crisis. He was hospitalized. He took a month's leave of absence. And when that month was over with, he did not return to that prestigious and prominent position that he had been entrusted with at such a young age. He felt like an absolute failure. It just so happened that he had a friend, a woman who was part of a religious order, a sister, who during that time of deep depression and distress in his life invited him to go see a movie. And I want to side road here for just a second to emphasize the importance of inviting our depressed friends to do social things. It's really important. So log that in your head for later. So Charles Pope and this religious sister plan to go and see the 6:30 show of Toy Story. And as they're going to the movie, they get held at gunpoint and robbed. Charles Pope explains he is so dejected, he is so depressed that he is still in quite a fog. He actually gives thanks to God for being in a mental health fog and depression, because he says, you know, if the sister and I had been held up just a few months prior, or maybe prior to him receiving that job, when he was still believing in his own bluster, he said, maybe I would have argued with the man who was trying to rob us. Maybe I would have been killed, maybe the sister too. He was pistol whipped by the person who was trying to rob him. The sister had to look at him and say, you have to give him your wallet. He just wasn't present during this violent attack that they experienced. The robber leaves. Charles Pope and the religious sister go to the police and they make a report, and then they go catch the 8 o'clock show of Toy Story. Charles Pope explains that as they're sitting there, they get to the scene where Woody and Buzz are there at Sid's house. You remember me talking about Sid earlier, the neighbor boy who did awful things to toys. They're quite scared and they need to escape. Buzz Lightyear is still believing that he is part of Space Command, and he keeps saying things like, to infinity and beyond. Buzz keeps smacking himself on the forehead and saying, you're a toy! But much like Charles Pope, Buzz believed his own bluster. The scene in the movie comes where Buzz Lightyear, in an attempt to escape Sid's house, climbs on top of the railing and prepares to fly away. And as the kids explain to us, Buzz Lightyear flies and falls. His arm falls off, and when it does, a little flap on his arm opens up, and he sees the stamp that says where this toy was made. In that moment, Charles Pope, in the movie theater, after having lost a job and experiencing a mental health crisis and being robbed at gunpoint with a friend at his side, bursts into tears. He was Buzz Lightyear. He believed. He believed that he was somebody other than who he actually was. And instead of flying, he fell really, really hard. I was talking with a friend recently about one of those life crises. And he said to me, you know, in that moment, you have 3 choices, really. You can continue to believe your own bluster. You can continue to make those choices that move you further and further out of your comfort zone, even though you have no business being there and your life is teetering on the edge. Or you can change your life a little. which means you'll just end up back in that same position again. Or you can give it all over to God. Surrender. Change your life entirely, and then in that moment, you become who God made you to be instead of who you believe you are. There's a big difference between those things. You'll notice in the story of the conversion of Saul, it's called, that Saul doesn't simply fall down on the ground, become blind, and then hop back up again and say, now I'm Paul and I've surrendered my life to God, and then he becomes this successful person. No, it takes time. And it takes the care of other people. Chase read the story for us today and talked about Ananias and the fact that Ananias cares for Saul, takes care of Saul. It's in that period of days and perhaps weeks that the real change occurs, that the real shift occurs. And Charles Pope talks about the same thing in his own life. He talks about how it took years of prayer and meditation and therapy to be able to fully recover from that moment. 10 years, in fact, he says. This is the amazing thing that happens in our lives. When we have those moments of crises, when we feel like we're flying and instead we fall flat on our face, this is the miracle that happens in that moment. That if we listen to the still small speaking voice and surrender our lives to God, God is able to help us grow and change and become who we were made to be. It's true what we say with the kids every single Sunday. Look at the lines on your thumb. You're the only person in all of history who's ever going to have those lines on a thumb. You are special and unique, and you have gifts and skills and talents, and you can learn new things. Thank God, because if we couldn't, we'd all be flat on the floor. And the best thing that you can do is not to believe that you can go to infinity and beyond. But the best thing for you to do is to figure out who you are and to remember whose you are. And then to move out into the world to be that. Remembering that Paul had Ananias and a whole host of people helping him, loving him into being. Friends, when we find ourselves falling instead of flying, may the same be true for us as well. Not just to infinity, but beyond. Amen.